Imagine traveling through the Missouri Ozarks in 1867, thirsty, exhausted, and desperate for a place to rest. You stop at a small cabin where two brothers greet you with a smile and a cup of water. But what they were really serving travelers has become one of the most disturbing cold cases in Missouri history. Today, we're uncovering the chilling story of the Ozarks brothers whose kindness hid something far more sinister. This case has been buried for over 150 years, but the truth is darker than anyone expected. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's step back into 1867, where not every traveler made it out alive. Three men entered an inn on a September evening in 1867. None of them would ever be seen alive again. This is the story of the Bender family of Kansas, except it isn't, because what happened in the Missouri Ozarks predates the Benders by 5 years. And the number of victims was far greater, and the perpetrators were never caught. The year is 1867. The place is a remote stretch of road in the Missouri Ozarks, cutting through Stone County, where the Springfield Road meets the old military trail. The Civil War has ended just 2 years prior. The region is still scarred, still bleeding, filled with displaced soldiers, wandering families, men looking for work, prospectors heading west, and those simply trying to forget what they saw in the war. And on this road there stood an inn. The Harp Brothers Inn, they called it. Though whether Harp was truly their name is something we'll examine later. William and Joshua Harp, two brothers who arrived in Stone County sometime in early 1866. They purchased a plot of land, built a modest structure, and opened their doors to travelers. The inn wasn't much to look at. A 2-story wooden building with a stone foundation, a stable out back, a well, a root cellar, 6 rooms for guests upstairs, a common room downstairs with a fireplace, a kitchen. The brothers ran it themselves. No wife, no help, just the two of them serving meals, tending horses, collecting payment. By all accounts, they were unremarkable men. William the elder was 42 years old, tall with dark hair going gray at the temples. Joshua was 38, shorter, stockier, with a thick beard. They spoke with southern accents, Kentucky perhaps, or Tennessee. They kept to themselves. They were polite but not warm. They charged fair prices. The food was adequate. The beds were clean enough. For 18 months, the Harp Brothers Inn operated without incident, and then in September 1867, 3 men disappeared. Their names were Thomas Eldridge, Martin Werner, and Samuel Potts. Eldridge was a former Union soldier, 41 years old, traveling from Springfield to Arkansas to visit his sister. Werner was a German immigrant, a tinker, 36 years old, with a cart full of pots and pans and tools. Potts was a young man, 23, a farmhand looking for work further south. They arrived at the inn on different days. Eldridge on September 12th, Werner on September 14th, Potts on September 15th. None of them reached their destinations. Now, disappearances weren't uncommon in 1867. The roads were dangerous. Bandits were everywhere. Former bushwhackers from the war still roamed the hills. Men fell off horses, got lost in the woods, drowned in rivers, died of illness far from help. A missing traveler was tragic but not extraordinary. Except Thomas Eldridge had told his sister in a letter that he would arrive by September 20th. When he didn't appear, she wrote to the postal station in Springfield. They had no record of him passing through after September 12th. Martin Werner had a business partner in Springfield who expected him to return by September 18th, to deliver completed repairs. He never returned. His cart never returned. Samuel Potts had promised his mother he would write from Arkansas. No letter ever came. By October, 3 separate families had reported their loved ones missing. All 3 had last been seen on the Springfield Road. All 3 should have passed through the area where the Harp Brothers Inn stood. The Stone County Sheriff at the time was a man named Amos Burton. Burton was 61 years old, a former farmer, not particularly ambitious or bright, but he did his job. When the reports reached him, he rode out to the inn on October 23, 1867. He found it abandoned. The front door was unlocked. The rooms were empty. No furniture, no belongings, no food in the kitchen. The fireplace was cold. The stable was empty. The well had been filled in with rocks and dirt. The brothers were gone. Burton searched the property. He found nothing unusual. No blood, no weapons, no signs of struggle. The inn was simply empty. It looked as though the brothers had packed up everything they owned and left. Burton filed a report stating that William and Joshua Harp had vacated their property without notice and were wanted for questioning regarding the disappearances of 3 travelers. He sent descriptions to surrounding counties. He posted notices in Springfield and Forsyth. No one ever saw the Harp brothers again, and that might have been the end of it. A mystery, certainly, but one among many in the chaotic years after the Civil War. 3 missing men. 2 suspicious brothers who fled. No bodies, no evidence, just absence. Except in November 1867, a farmer named Dutch Kramer made a discovery. Kramer lived 3 miles south of the inn. He was clearing brush near a creek on his property when his dog began barking at something in the undergrowth. Kramer went to investigate. He found a boot. A man's boot, still laced with a foot still inside it. Kramer ran for the sheriff. Burton returned with 2 deputies. They searched the area around the creek. Within an hour, they found the rest of the body partially buried under leaves and dirt, badly decomposed. The body had no identification, but it was wearing the remnants of a Union Army coat. Thomas Eldridge's sister identified the coat. Her brother had written to her describing it in detail, how he'd kept it from his service, how proud he was to have served. They'd found Thomas Eldridge, or what was left of him. The cause of death was immediately apparent. The back of his skull had been crushed. A single massive blow, likely from a hammer or an axe, delivered from behind while he was unaware. Burton ordered a more extensive search. Over the next week, they combed the woods around the inn. They found 2 more bodies. Martin Werner, the tinker, in a shallow grave half a mile from the inn. Same cause of death. Skull crushed from behind. Samuel Potts, the farmhand, in a ravine covered with stones. Same cause of death. 3 men, all killed the same way, all buried within a mile of the Harp Brothers Inn. Burton issued murder warrants for William and Joshua Harp. He sent telegrams to every county in Missouri and to neighboring states. He hired a tracker to try to follow the brothers' trail, but after 6 weeks, the tracker returned. Empty-handed, the brothers had vanished completely. And then, in December 1867, a man named Josiah Hendricks came forward with a story. Hendricks was a cattleman who had stayed at the Harp Brothers Inn back in August, a month before the disappearances began. He told Burton something he hadn't thought much about at the time, but that now seemed significant. On his last night at the inn, Hendricks had trouble sleeping. He woke sometime after midnight, needing to relieve himself. Rather than use the chamber pot in his room, he went outside to the privy. On his way back, he noticed a light in the stable. Curious, he approached quietly. Through a gap in the boards, he saw the two brothers inside. They were digging. There was a hole in the stable floor, perhaps 4 feet deep. As Hendricks watched, Joshua climbed out of the hole and William handed him a shovel. They spoke in low voices, too quiet for Hendricks to hear, and then they began filling the hole back in. Hendricks didn't think much of it. Perhaps they were burying garbage or hiding valuables or any number of innocent things. He went back to bed. But now, with 3 murdered men found near the inn, the image took on a darker meaning. Burton organized a group of 20 men. They returned to the abandoned inn and tore up the stable floor. What they found would haunt Stone County for generations. Beneath the stable floor, they discovered a pit, 10 feet long, 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep. And inside that pit were bones. Human bones. Dozens of them. Skulls, ribs, femurs, vertebrae all jumbled together, some still partially clothed, most picked clean. They spent 3 days carefully removing everything from the pit and laying it out in the yard. The local doctor, a man named Silas Reed, examined the remains. He determined they represented at least 19 individuals. 19 separate people, based on skull count and pelvic structures. The victims ranged from adult males to what appeared to be 2 women, and possibly an adolescent, though the bones were in such condition that exact identification was difficult. 19 victims, buried beneath the stable floor of an inn that had only been open for 18 months. The news spread rapidly. Newspapers in Springfield, St. Louis, and Kansas City ran stories about the Ozark Murder Inn and the Brothers of Death. People were horrified and fascinated in equal measure. Former guests of the inn came forward, each with their own stories of strange feelings, odd noises in the night, the brothers' peculiar behavior. But despite the attention, despite the rewards offered, despite the extensive manhunt, William and Joshua Harp were never found. And as investigators dug deeper into the case, they realized something troubling. Almost nothing about the brothers checked out. The deed to the property had been purchased under the name Harp, but the signature was barely legible and could have been anything. No one in the county had known the brothers before they arrived. They had no history, no references, no past that anyone could verify. The postmaster in Springfield recalled them receiving mail occasionally, but always under different names. Sometimes it was addressed to Harp, sometimes to Harper, sometimes to Hayes. A bank clerk remembered William opening an account but couldn't recall what name he'd used because the account had been closed just days before the brothers disappeared. All the money withdrawn. They were ghosts, men without pasts. And now they were gone, leaving behind only questions and a pit full of bones. Sheriff Burton spent the rest of his life searching for answers. He tracked down every lead, interviewed hundreds of people, traveled to other states following rumors of the brothers' whereabouts. He died in 1891, 24 years after the murders, never having found them. The Harp Brothers Inn was burned to the ground by local residents in December 1867. They burned the stable, the main building, the privy, everything. They filled in the murder pit with lime and dirt and stones. They wanted no trace of what had happened there to remain. But the land remembered. For years afterward, people reported strange occurrences near the site. Horses refusing to pass, dogs barking at nothing, unexplained sounds in the night. Most of this was likely imagination, fear, the human mind trying to make sense of senseless evil. But the question remained, who were William and Joshua Harp? Where did they come from? And where did they go? To answer those questions, we need to look back further. Before the inn, before Stone County, before Missouri, we need to look at a pair of names that appeared in Kentucky records 40 years earlier. The Harp brothers, not William and Joshua, Micajah and Wiley, America's first documented serial killers. In the year 1799, two men terrorized the frontier of Kentucky and Tennessee. They killed at least 40 people, possibly more. They were known as the Harp brothers, though they were likely cousins. Their names were Micajah Harp, called Big Harp, and Wiley Harp, called Little Harp. They were caught. Micajah was killed by a posse, beheaded, his head displayed on a pike as a warning. Wiley escaped but was captured 4 years later and hanged in 1804. This is established historical fact. But there's a problem with this narrative. Several problems, actually. First, the execution of Wiley Harp was poorly documented. The hanging took place in Mississippi Territory, in what is now Louisiana. Records from that period are sparse. There's a single newspaper account and one witness statement. No official death certificate. No photograph, obviously, this being 1804. Just a brief mention that Wiley Harp was hanged for piracy and murder. Second, descriptions of the Harp brothers are inconsistent. Some accounts describe Big Harp as a massive man over 6 feet tall, heavy-set. Others describe him as average height and thin. Little Harp is sometimes described as short, sometimes as taller than his brother. Eye color varies in reports from blue to brown to black. Third, and most significant, there were persistent rumors throughout the 1800s of Harp brothers appearing in different locations across the frontier. In Indiana in 1811, in Illinois in 1822, in Missouri in 1841. Each time the pattern was the same. Two men, brothers or claiming to be brothers, operating an inn or tavern, guests disappearing, bodies eventually found, the brothers vanishing before they could be caught. Most historians dismiss these as copycat crimes or legends inspired by the original Harps. But the similarities are remarkable, and the pattern continued for decades. So let's examine what we know about the Missouri Harps, the men who ran the inn in Stone County in 1867. Physical descriptions from witnesses who stayed at the inn. William Harp was tall, approximately 6 feet, thin build, dark hair graying, blue or gray eyes, slight limp favoring his left leg. Joshua Harp was shorter, 5'8" or 9", stockier, full beard, brown hair, brown eyes, scar on his right forearm. Ages, William claimed to be 42 in 1867, which would make his birth year 1825. Joshua claimed to be 38, birth year 1829. Wiley Harp was hanged in 1804. He could not have been the William Harp of Missouri. Unless he wasn't hanged. Unless someone else died in his place. Unless the execution was faked or botched or the records were falsified. This sounds like conspiracy thinking, and perhaps it is. But let's follow the evidence. In October 1867, Sheriff Burton received a letter. It was unsigned, posted from Cairo, Illinois. The letter read, "The men you seek are not who they claim. Look to the Cumberland. Look to the year 98. Look for the name Harker. They have done this before. They will do it again. You will never catch them." Burton didn't know what to make of the letter. He filed it with his other documents on the case. But he did look into the name Harker. In Cumberland County, Kentucky, there were records of a family named Harker. Samuel Harker and his wife Martha had 3 sons. Thomas, born 1783, William, born 1787, Joshua, born 1791. Thomas Harker died in the War of 1812. But there were no death records for William or Joshua after 1810. They simply disappeared from the records. No marriage licenses, no land deeds, no tax records, nothing. If William Harker was born in 1787, he would have been 80 years old in 1867. Too old to match descriptions of the Missouri William Harp. But if William Harker had a son, also named William, born around 1825, the age would match perfectly. And if Joshua Harker had a son named Joshua, born around 1829, that would also match. Burton wrote to authorities in Cumberland County, but the response he received was unhelpful. Records from that period were incomplete. Many have been lost or destroyed. There was no way to confirm or deny the connection. So Burton tried another approach. He looked for similar crimes in other states around the time the Harps would have been traveling. What he found was disturbing. In 1841, in Marion County, Missouri, near Hannibal, there was a brief newspaper mention of an inn where travelers had disappeared. Two men ran the inn, brothers, though their names weren't recorded in the article. Local authorities investigated but found no bodies. The brothers left town before they could be questioned. The inn was torn down. No further action was taken. In 1853, in Lawrence County, Arkansas, just south of the Missouri border, there was another incident. An establishment called the Wayside Inn, run by two men, no names given in the records. 3 travelers disappeared over a period of months. A posse searched the property and found human remains buried in the woods. The innkeepers had already fled. No one was ever arrested. In 1859, in Cherokee County, Kansas, there was yet another case. A roadhouse run by 2 brothers, names listed as William and Joshua Hayes in one document, William and Joshua Harper in another. 2 victims found. The brothers escaped. 3 incidents spread across 18 years in 3 different states, all within a few hundred miles of each other. All involving 2 brothers, all involving missing travelers, all ending with the brothers fleeing before capture, and the names Harp in Missouri, Hayes in Kansas, Harper in Arkansas, all variations of the same name. Burton became convinced he was dealing with something unprecedented. Not a single crime, but a pattern stretching back decades. 2 men, possibly related, possibly working with others, moving from place to place, operating inns and roadhouses, murdering guests, and disappearing before justice could be served. But who were they really, and why did they do it? The most common assumption, both in 1867 and today, is that the motive was robbery. Travelers carried money, sometimes quite a bit of it. Kill a guest, take their cash, dispose of the body, move on. It's a simple, logical explanation. But there are problems with this theory. First, many of the victims at the Stone County Inn were poor. Samuel Potts, the farmhand, likely had very little money. Martin Werner, the tinker, would have had some cash from his trade, but nothing substantial. When Eldridge's body was found, he was still wearing a ring and a pocket watch, items that could have been sold. Second, the bodies weren't disposed of efficiently. Burying victims on your own property, directly beneath your business, is incredibly risky. It would have been safer to dump them in the wilderness, in rivers, anywhere other than in a pit under the stable floor. Third, the brothers operated the inn for 18 months. If they were killing every guest, or even most guests, they would have been discovered much sooner. Witnesses indicated the inn was moderately busy, perhaps 3 or 4 guests a week. Over 18 months, that's potentially 200 to 300 guests. 22 bodies were found in total, 19 in the pit under the stable, plus the 3 in the woods. That's a fraction of the total number of people who stayed at the inn, which means the brothers were selective. They chose specific victims. So, what was the selection criteria? What made Thomas Eldridge, Martin Werner, and Samuel Potts targets, but allowed dozens of others to leave safely? Dr. Silas Reed, the physician who examined the remains, noted something in his report that Sheriff Burton initially overlooked. Of the 19 skeletons in the pit, 12 showed signs of healed fractures or old injuries. Broken arms, cracked ribs, old skull fractures that had mended. These weren't random travelers, these were people who had been through trauma. Soldiers likely, men injured in the war. The Civil War had ended in 1865. The inn opened in early 1866. The timing fit. Burton re-examined what he knew about the 3 victims found in the woods. Thomas Eldridge was a Union veteran. His sister confirmed he'd been injured at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, a minor wound to his shoulder. Samuel Potts wasn't a soldier, but his mother mentioned in her letters that he'd been in a bad accident as a child, fell from a barn loft and broke his leg, which never set properly and left him with a limp. Martin Werner the tinker had no military history, but German immigrants were often targeted by both sides during the war. It's possible he'd been injured during one of the many civilian attacks that occurred. The pattern became clearer. The Harper brothers were targeting men who were damaged, men who had been hurt, veterans, cripples, those bearing the scars of violence. But why? This question brings us to the most disturbing theory about the Harps. A theory that has been discussed in academic circles but rarely presented to the public because of how troubling it is. What if the Harps didn't kill for money or pleasure or any rational motive? What if they killed because they believed they were doing something righteous? Something necessary? There's a historical precedent for this. In medieval Europe, there were periodic incidents of individuals who believed they were purifying society by murdering those they deemed weak or damaged. They saw themselves as instruments of a higher purpose, cleansing the world of impurity. Is it possible the Harps saw themselves this way, as purifiers removing the broken and wounded from the world? The evidence for this theory is thin, but it exists. One of the few personal items found at the abandoned inn was a Bible. Inside the cover, someone had written a verse, though not one that appears in any known translation. The broken shall not inherit, the wounded shall not proceed. Flesh that has been torn must be torn again. Only the whole shall pass through the gate. This isn't scripture, it's something else. A personal belief, perhaps. A justification. If the Harps believed they were performing some kind of holy work, it would explain the selectivity of their victims. It would explain why they took such risks keeping bodies on the property. Perhaps they felt they needed to maintain control over the remains for some ritual purpose. It would explain why they continued this pattern for decades, moving from place to place, always eventually exposed but always escaping. They believed they had a mission, and they were willing to kill anyone who fit their criteria to fulfill it. Burton spent years trying to understand the brothers' psychology. He interviewed family members of victims, trying to find any connection beyond physical injury. He found none. The victims came from different backgrounds, different states, different beliefs. The only common thread was that each had been wounded in some way. In 1873, 6 years after the murders, Burton received another letter. Like the first, it was unsigned, postmarked from a different city, this time Memphis, Tennessee. The letter said, "You are looking for men. You should be looking for an idea. They are many. They have always been many. When one falls, another takes the name. The work continues. It has continued for 100 years. It will continue for 100 more. Look to the new territories. Look west. They are already there. Burton didn't know if the letter was genuine or from some crank seeking attention. But it reinforced his growing belief that he wasn't dealing with two men, but with something larger. A movement, a cult. A tradition passed down through generations. He began investigating claims of similar crimes in Western territories, Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, and he found them. Small mentions in newspapers. Disappeared travelers, suspicious innkeepers. Always two men, always. Brothers or claiming to be brothers. But never caught. Never identified. Always gone before anyone could gather enough evidence. It was as if there was a network, as if these men communicated with each other, warned each other, protected each other. Burton died in 1891 without ever solving the case. But his files, preserved in the Stone County records, paint a picture of something far more complex than a simple murder investigation. They suggest that the Harp brothers of 1867 were part of a legacy, that the name itself was passed down, adopted by new killers who took on the identity and continued the work. And if that's true, then the question isn't just who were William and Joshua Harp. The question is, how many Harps have there been? And are there still Harps operating today? In December 1867, Sheriff Amos Burton placed an advertisement in newspapers across Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and Illinois. The advertisement read, "Any person who lodged at the Harp Brothers Inn in Stone County, Missouri between January 1866 and September 1867 is requested to contact the Stone County Sheriff's Office. Information regarding the proprietors and their activities is sought. Confidentiality assured." Over the next 6 months, Burton received 43 responses. 43 people who had stayed at the inn and survived. Each of them had a story. And when Burton compiled these accounts, a clearer picture emerged of what life was like at the inn during those 18 months of operation. More importantly, patterns became visible. Patterns that might explain how the brothers selected their victims. The first response came from a merchant named Robert Dalton. Dalton had stayed at the inn in March 1866, just a few weeks after it opened. He wrote, "I arrived at the inn late in the afternoon, having traveled from Springfield. The elder brother, William, greeted me at the door. He was polite but reserved. He showed me to a room on the second floor, a simple space with a bed, a chair, and a small table. The rate was fair, 25 cents for the night, meals included. Supper was served in the common room. There were 2 other guests that evening, a farmer and his wife from Arkansas. The younger brother Joshua cooked and served the food. It was basic fare, salt pork and beans, cornbread, coffee. The brothers ate separately in the kitchen, not with the guest. What struck me was the silence. The brothers rarely spoke, even to each other. When they did speak, it was in low voices, hard to hear. The farmer tried to make conversation, asking where the brothers were from, how long they'd been in Missouri. William gave vague answers. Kentucky, he said, though he didn't specify where. They'd been in Stone County about 2 months. After supper, we sat by the fire. The farmer's wife was knitting. The farmer was reading a newspaper. I was reviewing my account books. The brothers had withdrawn to the kitchen. I could hear them moving about, washing dishes, the scrape of a chair. At one point, Joshua came out to put more wood on the fire. As he bent down, I noticed a scar on his wrist, a long white line. It looked like a burn, old and healed. He saw me looking and pulled his sleeve down quickly. I slept well that night. In the morning, the brothers served breakfast. Eggs, fried potatoes, more cornbread. I paid my bill and left. I had no reason to think anything was wrong. The inn was plain but clean. The brothers were odd but not threatening. I continued south to Arkansas and thought nothing more of it until I heard about the murders. Dalton's account was typical of many Burton received. Guests described the brothers as quiet, withdrawn, but not overtly suspicious. The inn was run efficiently. The rooms were maintained. The food was acceptable. Nothing seemed amiss. But other accounts were more troubling. A woman named Sarah Cunningham stayed at the inn in May 1866 with her husband Charles. She wrote, "We arrived in the evening, just before dark. My husband had injured his back the previous day lifting a wagon wheel and was in considerable pain. He could barely walk. I had to help him from the horse. William Harp met us outside. He looked at my husband in a strange way. Not with sympathy, but with something else. Interest, perhaps. He asked what had happened. My husband explained the injury. William nodded slowly, then said, 'You should rest here. Stay 2 nights. Give your back time to heal.' We had planned to stay only 1 night, but my husband's pain was severe, so we agreed. William showed us to a room. As he left, he said, 'I'll prepare something for the pain. Joshua knows herbs.' That night, Joshua brought a tea to our room. He said it would help with inflammation. My husband drank it. Within an hour, he was asleep, deeply asleep. I tried to wake him several times during the night, and he barely stirred. I didn't drink the tea. I don't know why. Something about the way Joshua watched as he gave it to us made me uncomfortable. I stayed awake most of the night, listening. The inn was very quiet, too quiet. No sounds from other rooms, no creaking floorboards, nothing. In the morning, my husband woke feeling somewhat better, though groggy. We had breakfast. William again suggested we stay another night. My husband was inclined to agree, but I insisted we leave. I told him we needed to reach his brother's house in Arkansas. It was a lie, but I wanted out of that place. William didn't argue. We paid and left. It wasn't until months later when I heard about the murders that I realized how close we came. My husband had been injured. He was vulnerable. If we had stayed another night, if I had drunk that tea and slept as deeply as my husband, what would have happened? I think about it often. I see William's face in my dreams, the way he looked at my husband, like he was evaluating him, judging whether he was suitable for something. We were lucky. Others were not. This account, and others like it, revealed something critical. The brothers actively tried to keep certain guests at the inn longer. Guests who were injured, ill, or otherwise weakened. They encouraged extended stays. They offered remedies and treatments. They created opportunities. But they didn't harm every vulnerable person who stayed there. Sarah and Charles Cunningham left safely despite Charles's injury. So what was different about them? Why were they spared when others weren't? A possible answer came from a man named Eugene Marsh. Marsh stayed at the inn in July 1866. He was traveling alone, having recently been discharged from military service due to a shoulder wound that never properly healed. By his own description, he was exactly the kind of victim the Harps seemed to target. He wrote, "I arrived at the inn on a Thursday afternoon. William greeted me and asked where I was headed. I told him I was going to Forsyth to meet my brother, who was expecting me on Saturday. William asked if my brother knew exactly when I would arrive. I said yes, that I had written him a letter the week prior with my travel schedule. William showed me to a room. I stayed 2 nights. During that time, the brothers were courteous. They asked about my shoulder, noticed my limp from an old leg wound. Joshua offered me a salve for the shoulder. I declined. I don't care for folk remedies. On Friday evening, another guest arrived. A man traveling alone, no family expecting him. He had a limp worse than mine. He told the brothers he was just passing through had no particular destination. I left Saturday morning. As I was preparing my horse, I saw William and Joshua talking in low voices near the stable, glancing at the other guest. I didn't think much of it then. That guest was Samuel Potts. I learned later that he disappeared the day I left. The pattern became clear. The brothers were meticulous. They assessed not just the physical vulnerability of guests, but their social connections. Did anyone know where they were? Was anyone expecting them? Would anyone come looking? Solo travelers with no clear destination were ideal targets. Men with no family nearby, no friends waiting, no one who would miss them immediately. Injured soldiers who were drifting, trying to find their place in a post-war world. Immigrants who had no community. Drifters, wanderers, the forgotten. These were the people the Harps killed. And they did so with calculation, ensuring that by the time anyone realized someone was missing, the trail was cold, and the brothers could claim the guest had simply left and continued their journey. But there were exceptions. There were guests who should have been perfect victims but survived. Why? A man named Jacob Torres provided insight. Torres was a former Confederate soldier badly wounded at the Battle of Pea Ridge. He'd lost 2 fingers on his left hand and had a pronounced limp. He stayed at the inn in August 1867, just a month before the murders were discovered. He was traveling alone. No one was expecting him. By all accounts, he should have been killed. He wrote, "I arrived late, near midnight. The inn was dark except for a single lamp in the window. William answered my knock. He looked annoyed to be woken, but let me in. He asked where I was coming from, where I was going. I told him I'd been at my brother's place in Springfield and was heading to my own land in Arkansas. Your own land? He asked. Yes, I said. Got my deed right here. I showed him the property deed I'd been carrying. 40 acres in Pope County, Arkansas, bought with my military pension. William looked at the deed carefully, then he said, You're a landowner then. That's right, I said. He showed me to a room. In the morning, Joshua served breakfast. They were both quiet, but I noticed them speaking to each other in the kitchen, heads close together. When I paid my bill, William said, Safe travels to your property. Something about the way he emphasized property struck me. It was as if it mattered to him, as if it changed something. This was the key. The Harps didn't just target the vulnerable, they targeted the vulnerable who had no stake in the world. No property, no status, no position. Men who wouldn't be missed not just by family, but by society. A landowner, even a poor one, had standing. A man with a deed had his name in a registry. If he disappeared, there would be questions about his land, about inheritance, about ownership. There would be investigation. A drifter had none of that. He could vanish and the world would simply close over the gap where he'd been. The Harps understood this. They weren't just serial killers, they were social predators, selecting victims based on a sophisticated understanding of who mattered and who didn't. And it worked. For 18 months, they killed with impunity. They murdered at least 22 people, possibly more. and they might have continued indefinitely if not for one mistake. They killed Thomas Eldridge. Eldridge was a drifter, a wounded veteran, traveling alone. He fit the profile perfectly. But he had one thing the others didn't: a sister who loved him. A sister who wrote letters. A sister who, when he didn't arrive as promised, refused to accept that he'd simply moved on. She pushed the postmaster in Springfield to investigate. She wrote to the sheriff. She offered a reward from her own modest savings. She made noise. And that noise eventually led to the discovery of the bodies and the unraveling of the Harps operation. One sister's love brought down what might have been the most successful serial killing operation in 19th century America. Burton compiled all 43 witness statements into a detailed report. He noted commonalities, the brothers' quietness, their interest in injured guests, their questions about destinations and expectations, their offers of extended stays and herbal remedies. He also noted the guests who never wrote to him, the ones who stayed at the inn and vanished. Based on the guest book fragments found at the abandoned inn, partially burned but still partially legible, Burton estimated approximately 230 people stayed at the Harp Brothers Inn during its operation. 43 survived to write to him. 22 bodies were found. That left approximately 165 guests unaccounted for. Some of those certainly survived, and simply didn't respond to Burton's advertisement. They might have never seen it, or didn't think they had relevant information, or didn't want to be involved in a murder investigation. But how many? 90? 100? Which meant there could have been 60 to 75 additional victims. Bodies that were never found, disposed of more carefully than the others, dumped in rivers, buried in remote locations, burned, destroyed in ways that left no trace. Burton searched. He organized teams to comb the woods surrounding the inn for a radius of 5 miles. They searched for months. They dug in areas where the ground looked disturbed. They dragged sections of nearby creeks and streams. They found nothing more. If there were additional victims, they remained hidden. But there was one more discovery that Burton made while reviewing the witness statements. Something that suggested the Harps might have had help. 3 different witnesses mentioned seeing a third man at the inn, though only briefly. A man who wasn't William or Joshua. A man who appeared to be working on the property but who was never introduced to guests. The first mention came from a witness named Albert Chen, who stayed at the inn in April 1866. I was outside in the morning, tending to my horse, when I saw a man walking from the woods toward the stable. He was carrying an axe. He was younger than the brothers, perhaps 30 years old, with red hair and a thin build. He saw me watching and immediately turned and went back into the woods. I asked William about him later, who he was. William said it was just a hired hand who helped with wood cutting. But I never saw him again during my stay. The second mention came from a witness named Dorothy Hayes, who stayed with her father in June 1866. My father and I were walking near the property line in the evening. We saw a man in the distance, maybe 200 yards away, digging in a clearing. He had red hair. I remember that clearly because it caught the last light of the sun. My father called out to him, just a friendly greeting. The man looked up, stared at us for a moment, then grabbed his shovel and walked away quickly into the trees. We mentioned it to William that night. He seemed irritated and said we shouldn't wander so far from the inn. Not safe, he said. Wolves in these woods. The third mention came from Josiah Hendricks, the cattleman who had seen the brothers digging in the stable at midnight. In a follow-up interview with Burton, Hendricks remembered something else. About a week before I saw them digging, I was out early one morning before dawn. I was checking on my cattle in the stable. Through the window, I saw someone walking across the property toward the woods. It wasn't William or Joshua. I knew their shapes by then, the way they moved. This was someone else. Thinner. He was carrying what looked like a bundle over his shoulder wrapped in cloth. I couldn't see his face in the darkness, but when he passed under the moon for a moment, I saw his hair. It was red or light-colored, something that caught the light. 3 witnesses. 3 sightings of a red-haired man. A man who avoided contact with guests. A man the brothers never properly explained. Burton searched for any records of the Harps hiring help. He found none. No payments recorded, no names mentioned in any documents. The red-haired man was a ghost, just like the brothers. Was he an accomplice? A third brother? A victim who was forced to help before he himself was killed? Or was he something else entirely? Perhaps the person who wrote the anonymous letters to Burton, someone who knew what the brothers were doing but was too afraid or too complicit to come forward directly? Burton never found out. The red-haired man, if he existed as more than coincidence or misidentification, vanished along with William and Joshua Harp. But his presence suggested something important. The brothers might not have worked alone. There might have been a network, a support system, others who knew about the murders and either participated or enabled them. This theory gained some support from another strange detail Burton uncovered. In the months before the inn was abandoned, William Harp had made several trips to Springfield. The livery stable owner there remembered him because William always paid in cash, always silver coins, and always asked the same question. Has anyone been asking about me? Why would he ask that? Was he expecting someone? Waiting for a warning that authorities were getting close? Or was he checking in with someone, reporting to someone, coordinating with someone? Burton believed the latter. He believed the Harps were part of something larger, an organization that helped them move from place to place, establish new identities, avoid capture. But he could never prove it. The evidence was too thin, too circumstantial. All he had were witness statements, bones, and questions, 22 confirmed victims, possibly 75 more. 2 killers who vanished, and a red-haired man who might have been the key to everything. By early 1868, Sheriff Amos Burton had exhausted every lead in Stone County. The Harp brothers were gone. The red-haired accomplice was nowhere to be found. The witness statements had been collected and analyzed. The property had been searched thoroughly. Burton was at an impasse, but he was also convinced that the Harps had killed before they arrived in Stone County and would likely kill again wherever they'd fled to. So he began reaching out to law enforcement in other jurisdictions, sending detailed descriptions of the brothers and their methods, asking if anyone had encountered similar cases. The responses he received were illuminating. In January 1868, Burton got a letter from a sheriff in Lawrence County, Arkansas. The sheriff's name was Marcus Wade, and he had been in office for less than a year, but he'd inherited files from his predecessor that seemed relevant to Burton's inquiry. Wade wrote, "In September 1853, there was an incident at a place called the Wayside Inn, located on the road between Walnut Ridge and Pocahontas. 2 men ran the establishment, though records from that time don't clearly indicate their names. Several travelers disappeared over a period of about 4 months. Eventually, a posse searched the property, and found 3 bodies buried in the woods nearby. All 3 had been killed the same way: blunt force trauma to the back of the head. The innkeepers fled before they could be arrested. My predecessor organized a manhunt, but the trail went cold. The property was eventually sold at auction. The new owner tore down the inn and built a regular homestead there. In the file, there's a physical description of one of the innkeepers, taken from a witness statement. Tall man, dark hair, approximate age 40, slight limp on left side. The other man was described as shorter, stocky build, full beard, brown hair, age approximately 35. I don't know if these are the same men you're looking for, but the similarities are notable. If they are the same, then they've been doing this for at least 14 years. 14 years! From 1853 to 1867. If the men in Arkansas were the same as the men in Missouri, they'd been operating for over a decade, moving from location to location, killing and escaping, refining their methods. But there was a problem with the timeline. The man described in 1853 as approximately 40 years old should have been 54 in 1867. William Harp claimed to be 42. Either he was lying about his age or these weren't the same men. Unless, as the anonymous letter suggested, the name Harp was being passed from one set of killers to another. Like a title. A legacy. Burton wrote back to Wade asking for any additional details. Wade sent copies of the witness statements from 1853. Burton read them carefully, looking for patterns. One statement stood out. It was from a farmer named Russell Pike, who had stayed at the Wayside Inn in August 1853, about a month before the bodies were discovered. Pike wrote, "The 2 men who ran the inn were strange fellows. They didn't talk much, kept to themselves. But one night I couldn't sleep, and I got up to get some air. I heard voices coming from the stable. I walked over quiet-like and listened. The 2 men were arguing in low voices. I couldn't make out most of it, but I heard one of them say, 'We need to move soon. They're looking in Tennessee. We can't stay here much longer.' I didn't think much of it at the time. Figured they had some business troubles, maybe debt collectors after them. But thinking back on it now, after what was found, I wonder if they were talking about running from the law for something they'd done before." Tennessee. They'd been in Tennessee before Arkansas. Burton immediately wrote to sheriffs in Tennessee, asking about any similar cases prior to 1853. It took months to receive responses, but eventually, he heard back from a deputy in Jackson, Tennessee. The deputy, a man named William Cross, wrote, "There was an incident in Madison County in 1847. A boarding house near the road to Memphis. Run by 2 brothers. Names in the records listed as Harper. First names unclear. Documents from that period are damaged. 4 travelers went missing over about 6 months. The bodies were never found, but there was enough suspicion that authorities searched the property. They found bloodstains in one of the rooms that had been painted over. The brothers disappeared before they could be questioned. Physical descriptions from witnesses match what you've described. 1 tall, 1 shorter and stockier. Ages at that time were estimated at mid-30s and early 30s, respectively. Burton did the math. If the men were in their mid-30s in 1847, they'd be in their early 50s by 1867. Again, too old to match the Missouri descriptions. But if those men in 1847 were the fathers or older brothers or mentors to the men in 1867, the pattern made sense. The knowledge and methods were being passed down. Each generation learned from the previous one, adopted the same strategies, used variations of the same name. It was a legacy of murder, stretching back decades. Burton became obsessed with tracing this legacy as far back as possible. He spent his own money on postage, sending dozens of letters to law enforcement across the South and Midwest. He subscribed to newspaper archives, searching for any mention of suspicious innkeepers, missing travelers, unsolved murders near roadhouses. And he found them. Small mentions, brief articles, half-forgotten cases. A pattern that stretched back to the 1820s. In 1841, a case in Pike County, Missouri. 2 men running an inn. Travelers disappeared. The men fled before investigation was complete. In 1835, a case in Wayne County, Kentucky. A tavern run by brothers. 3 bodies found. The brothers escaped. In 1829, a case in Hardin County, Illinois. A roadhouse, missing travelers, 2 proprietors who vanished. In 1822, a case in Clark County, Indiana. An inn near the Ohio River. 2 men described as brothers. Several disappearances. The men were gone before anyone put the pieces together. Each case was similar. 2 men, brothers, or claiming to be brothers, running an establishment for travelers. Victims selected carefully. The killers disappearing before capture. But the trail went back even further. In 1872, 4 years into his investigation, Burton received a package in the mail. It came from a retired judge in Kentucky named Thaddeus Morton. Morton had read about the Missouri case in the newspapers and felt compelled to reach out. Inside the package was a handwritten account, 40 pages long, describing events that had occurred in Kentucky in the 1790s and early 1800s. Judge Morton had been a young attorney during that time and had been peripherally involved in the prosecution of the original Harp brothers, Makaja and Wiley. Morton's account included details that weren't widely known. He wrote, "The Harp brothers were more than simple murderers. They had a philosophy, if you can call it that. Wiley in particular was known to speak about the weak and the wounded. He believed that people who had been damaged by life, the injured, the scarred, the broken, were corrupted. He believed they spread their corruption to others and that the only way to stop this spread was to remove them. This wasn't just madness, it was calculated. Wiley had been educated to some degree. He could read and write, unusual for the frontier. He kept journals, though most were destroyed when he was captured, but I saw one page that survived. On it he had written, 'Took 3 today, 2 men with soldier wounds, 1 woman with burned hands. The line must be kept pure. The damaged cannot pass.' What line he meant, I don't know. What he thought he was protecting, I can't say. But it was clear he believed he was doing necessary work. When Wiley was hanged in 1804, I was present. I was there to witness justice done. But I remember something odd. As the hood was placed over his head, he spoke his last words. He said, 'There are others. They know the work. It will continue.' At the time, I thought he was just ranting, trying to frighten us. But now, reading about these cases in Missouri and elsewhere, I wonder if he was telling the truth. If there were others who believed as he did, if they've been continuing his work for decades." Burton read Morton's account multiple times. It confirmed his worst suspicions. This wasn't just about money or sadistic pleasure. The Harps believed they were fulfilling some kind of mission. They saw themselves as righteous, and they'd been passing this mission down for over 70 years. But if this were true, if there was an actual organization or tradition of killers operating under the Harp name, then how were they connected? How did they communicate? How did one generation find and train the next? Burton had no answers. But he had a theory. He believed that the harps targeted specific types of victims, not just because they were easy to kill and easy to cover up, but because they were recruiting. They were looking for certain kinds of people, perhaps young men who were damaged themselves, isolated, angry, vulnerable to influence. They would take these young men in, indoctrinate them, train them, and eventually send them out to continue the work. The red-haired man at the Stone County Inn might have been one such recruit. Perhaps he'd been a victim himself at first, someone the brothers had selected. But instead of killing him, they'd turned him, showed him their philosophy, convinced him to join them, and when the inn was abandoned, he'd fled with them, learning from them, preparing to one day run his own establishment. It was a horrifying thought that each generation of harps was not just killing, but creating the next generation of killers. An exponential growth of murder spreading across the country like a disease. Burton tried to find evidence for this theory. He looked for patterns in the victims. Were any of them young men who fit the profile but had disappeared without bodies being found? Could they have been recruits rather than victims? The evidence was inconclusive. Of the 22 bodies found in Stone County, none were of young men without prior injuries. They were all clearly victims, not potential accomplices. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Just because no recruits were found in the burial pit didn't mean no recruits existed. They would have been the ones who left the inn alive, who traveled on with the brothers, who learned and eventually scattered to set up their own operations. Burton became convinced that somewhere in America there were more harps, maybe dozens of them, operating in remote areas, targeting the forgotten, killing with impunity. He spent the last 2 decades of his life trying to find them. He corresponded with law enforcement across the country. He traveled when he could afford it, investigating similar cases in person. He compiled a massive file, hundreds of pages, documenting what he believed was a network of serial killers stretching back to the 1790s. When he died in 1891, his family donated his files to the Stone County Historical Society. For decades, they sat in storage, largely forgotten. Historians occasionally reference them when writing about the Harp Brothers Inn case, but most dismissed Burton's larger theories as the obsession of a man who had been traumatized by what he'd found and had seen patterns where none existed. But in 1934, something happened that brought Burton's theories back into consideration. A case in Montana, a remote inn, 2 men running it, travelers disappearing, and when authorities finally investigated, they found a burial pit beneath the stable floor. Inside were the remains of 14 people. The proprietors had fled days before. Their names were listed in local records as William and Joshua Harper. The town of Lewistown, Montana, 1934. Population approximately 4,000. Cattle country. Ranches sprawled across the rolling hills. The road from Great Falls to Billings cut through the area, and along that road, about 15 miles south of Lewistown, there stood an establishment called the Harper Inn. The inn had been there for about 3 years, opened in 1931, right in the middle of the Depression. It was a modest place offering cheap rooms and meals to travelers passing through. In hard times, any place that offered a bed and food for a reasonable price had a business. The Harper Inn was run by 2 brothers, William Harper, age given as 47, Joshua Harper, age given as 43. They claimed to have come from South Dakota, fleeing the Dust Bowl, looking for a fresh start. They were quiet men, polite but reserved. They ran the inn efficiently. The locals had little interaction with them beyond basic commerce. Travelers came and went. Life continued. Until March 1934, when a cattle rancher named Douglas Bentley became concerned about one of his hired hands. The hired hand's name was Frank Osborne, a young man of 25 who had been working on Bentley's ranch for about 8 months. Frank was a good worker, reliable, but he had a troubled past. He'd been injured in a farming accident as a teenager, lost 3 fingers on his right hand. The disability made it hard for him to find steady work, but Bentley had given him a chance. In early March, Frank asked for a few days off. He said he wanted to ride down to visit a friend in Roundup, about 60 miles south. Bentley agreed. Frank left on a Monday morning, saying he'd be back by Thursday. Thursday came. Friday passed. By Saturday, Bentley was worried. Frank had never been unreliable before. Bentley rode into Lewistown and asked around. No one had seen Frank pass through town. Bentley sent a telegram to Roundup, to the friend Frank was supposedly visiting. The response came back. Frank had never arrived. The friend hadn't heard from him. Bentley reported Frank's disappearance to the Fergus County Sheriff's Office. The deputy who took the report asked Bentley to describe Frank's route. Bentley said Frank would have taken the road south toward Roundup. That road passed right by the Harper Inn. The deputy, a man named Carl Reeves, decided to ride out to the inn and ask if the Harper brothers had seen Frank pass by. It was routine inquiry, nothing more. Reeves arrived at the Harper Inn on March 18, 1934, in the early afternoon. He found the place empty. The door was unlocked. The rooms were vacant. The kitchen was clean. No sign of the brothers. This immediately struck Reeves as odd. You don't just abandon a business in the middle of the day, leaving the door open. He searched the property. The stable was empty as well. The brothers' horses were gone. Reeves noticed something else. The stable floor looked disturbed. There were fresh boards nailed down in one section, newer than the surrounding planks. The nails were shiny, recently driven. Reeves had been a deputy for 12 years. He'd seen enough to know when something wasn't right. He rode back to Lewistown and returned with Sheriff Patrick Murphy and 2 more deputies. They brought tools, and they tore up the stable floor. Beneath it, they found a pit, 8 feet by 6 feet, roughly 7 feet deep. Inside were human remains, partially decomposed bodies, some reduced to skeletons, layered one on top of another. They spent 2 days carefully removing everything from the pit and laying it out for examination. The county coroner, Dr. Harold Simmons, examined the remains. He determined there were 14 separate individuals. 10 men, 3 women, 1 adolescent boy. The causes of death varied. Some had been shot. Some had been stabbed. At least 3 showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, the same method used by the Missouri Harps. The bodies had been there for varying lengths of time. Some were relatively recent, perhaps a few months old. Others had been there much longer, possibly since the inn opened in 1931. Sheriff Murphy immediately issued warrants for William and Joshua Harper. He sent telegrams to law enforcement across Montana and neighboring states. He contacted the FBI, which had recently been granted broader jurisdiction over interstate crimes. The description of the Harper brothers went out nationwide. And that's when someone at the FBI made a connection. An agent named Robert Calloway was reviewing old files looking for similar cases. He came across a summary of the Missouri Harp case from 1867. The similarities were impossible to ignore. 2 brothers, an inn, missing travelers, a burial pit under the stable floor. Victims killed in similar ways. Even the names were nearly identical. Harp in Missouri, Harper in Montana. Calloway brought this to the attention of his superior, and the FBI officially opened an investigation into what they termed the Harp killings. It was one of the first times the FBI had investigated a serial murder case spanning multiple states and decades. Agents began combing through historical records looking for similar cases. They found dozens. Small-town sheriffs and big-city detectives had been encountering variations of the same crime for over a century, but no one had connected them until now. The FBI compiled a list of suspected Harp-related murders. Missouri, 1867, 22 confirmed victims. Montana, 1934, 14 confirmed victims. Arkansas, 1853, 3 confirmed victims. Tennessee, 1847, 4 suspected victims, no bodies found. Missouri, 1841, 2 suspected victims. Kentucky, 1835, 3 confirmed victims. Illinois, 1829, 5 suspected victims. Indiana, 1822, 4 suspected victims. Kentucky, Tennessee, 1799, 1804, 40 plus. Confirmed victims, the original Makaja and Wiley Harp. The total count of confirmed and suspected victims exceeded 100, spanning 135 years. If this was truly a connected series of crimes, it would be the longest-running serial murder case in American history. The FBI's theory, similar to Sheriff Burton's decades earlier, was that this represented either a family tradition passed down through generations or some kind of cult or organization that recruited new members and trained them in the methods. But the FBI had resources Burton never had. They could conduct a nationwide investigation. They could coordinate across state lines. They could use modern forensics and communication technology. They launched a manhunt for William and Joshua Harper. Photographs were distributed. The brothers had been photographed once for a local business directory in 1932. The images were grainy but clear enough to show their faces. William was indeed tall and thin with dark hair. Joshua was shorter, stockier, bearded. Tips came in from across the country. Sightings in Wyoming, in Idaho, in Oregon, in California. The FBI followed each lead, but none panned out. The brothers had vanished, just like their predecessors in Missouri 67 years earlier. But the Montana case provided something the Missouri case hadn't. Evidence. Physical evidence that could be analyzed with modern techniques. The FBI examined the bodies from the pit. They identified several of the victims through dental records and personal effects. One victim was Frank Osborne, the hired hand who had gone missing. His body was identified by the missing fingers on his right hand. Other victims included Margaret Sullivan, age 39, a widow traveling to California, missing since December 1933. She had burn scars on her arms from a house fire years earlier. Robert Chen, age 48, a Chinese immigrant, a laborer, missing since August 1933. He had a severely twisted foot from an injury sustained during railroad construction. Thomas Whitfield, age 52, a war veteran, missing since June 1932. He had shrapnel scars and a limp from his service in World War I. Catherine Rhodes, age 34, traveling with her son, Michael Rhodes, age 13. Both missing since October 1933. Catherine had been badly injured in a car accident the year before and walked with a cane. Michael had a clubfoot. The pattern was undeniable. Every single victim had some form of physical disability or scarring. Injuries from accidents, birth defects, war wounds, burns. Each of them had been damaged in some way. The FBI brought in a psychological consultant, one of the first times such expertise was used in a criminal investigation. His name was Dr. Walter Brennan, a psychiatrist from New York who had studied criminal psychology in Europe. Dr. Brennan reviewed all the evidence from Montana and the historical cases. He wrote a profile of the killers, attempting to understand their motivations. His report included this assessment. The perpetrators, who adopt the name Harp or variations thereof, demonstrate a consistent pattern of victim selection based on physical imperfection. This is not opportunistic killing. This is ideological killing. The killers believe they are purifying society of the weak and damaged. This belief system likely has deep roots, passed down through oral tradition within a family or cult structure. Each generation of killers is indoctrinated into this belief and takes on the mission as their own. The adoption of the Harp name is significant. It suggests either biological lineage from the original Harps or deliberate assumption of identity as a form of honoring the founders of this tradition. The name carries weight within the group. It represents legitimacy and continuity. The selection of inns and roadhouses as bases of operation is strategic. These establishments provide access to a steady stream of potential victims while offering a legitimate cover for the killer's presence in a community. The victims are travelers, people away from home, whose disappearances will not be immediately noticed. The burial of bodies on the property, rather than disposal elsewhere, suggests the killers feel ownership over their victims. The bodies are trophies, evidence of their mission's success. The risk of discovery is high, yet they take this risk consistently, which indicates the importance of keeping the bodies close. Based on the pattern of operations, I believe there are likely other Harp killers currently active in remote areas of the country. The Montana killers fled before capture, which means they are still at large. Additionally, if the theory of a multi-generational organization is correct, there may be younger killers being trained, preparing to establish their own operations. This is not a case that will be solved by capturing 2 men. This is a case that requires dismantling an entire hidden tradition of murder. Dr. Brennan's report caused significant concern within the FBI. If he was right, there could be dozens of victims yet to be discovered and multiple killers still operating. The FBI expanded their investigation. They contacted law enforcement in every state, asking them to review any unsolved disappearances near inns, taverns, or roadhouses, particularly in rural areas. They asked for reports of suspicious proprietors who had fled suddenly. The responses came flooding in. Over the next year, the FBI received reports of over 300 suspicious cases. Most turned out to be unrelated. Financial problems, family disputes, ordinary crimes. But several cases stood out. In New Mexico, an inn that had operated from 1928 to 1931, run by 2 brothers named Hayes. Travelers had disappeared. The brothers left suddenly. When authorities searched the property years later, after the Montana case made news, they found bones buried behind the stable. In Idaho, a roadhouse operated from 1919 to 1923 by 2 men named Harper. Reports of missing travelers. The men disappeared before anyone investigated thoroughly. In Oregon, another case from 1925 to 1927. 2 brothers, an inn, disappearances. The pattern was everywhere. Once you knew to look for it. But despite this mounting evidence, despite the nationwide manhunt, the Harper brothers from Montana were never found. The FBI kept the case open for decades. Occasionally, there would be a new lead, a sighting, a tip, but nothing ever led to an arrest. In 1956, the FBI received an anonymous letter postmarked from Vancouver, Canada. The letter read, "You're looking in the wrong places. You're looking for men. You should be looking for a family. Look for the name Harker. Look in Kentucky. Look in the old records before the Harps. The blood goes back further than you think. It started with a belief that the damaged should not be allowed to spread their damage. That belief has been passed down for 200 years. It will continue for 200 more. You will never stop it. There are too many of us. The letter was signed, "A Friend." The FBI investigated the name Harker in Kentucky. They found records of the Harker family, the same family Sheriff Burton had investigated in the 1870s. The trail was old and cold. Most of the family had died out or scattered. Those who remained had no criminal records and claimed no knowledge of any family tradition of violence. The investigation stalled again, but the letter's claim, "There are too many of us," haunted the investigators. If true, it meant the Harp killings weren't the work of a few individuals across time, but an active, ongoing conspiracy. A network of killers all following the same methods, all believing in the same twisted ideology. In 1963, the FBI officially closed the active investigation into the Harper brothers from Montana. The case remained unsolved. The brothers were presumed dead, having been in their 40s in 1934, which would make them in their 70s by the 1960s. But the larger question remained, were there other Harps? Was the tradition continuing? The FBI kept a file open, a general file on what they termed Harp pattern killings. Any case that matched the profile, 2 male perpetrators, an inn or roadhouse, missing travelers, victims with physical disabilities, was flagged and investigated. Over the following decades, a few cases fit the pattern, but none could be definitively linked to a Harp killer. The evidence was always circumstantial. The perpetrators, if they existed, had learned to be more careful. Or perhaps they'd stopped entirely. Or perhaps they'd simply gotten better at hiding. To understand the Harps, we need to go back to the beginning, to Kentucky, to the 1790s, to the original brothers. Micajah Harp and Wiley Harp appeared in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1797. They were in their early 30s. They claimed to have come from North Carolina. They had 2 women with them, Susan and Betsy Roberts, who were sisters. The brothers married the sisters, though whether the marriages were legal is unclear. The 4 of them lived on the outskirts of Knoxville for several months. Micajah and Wiley took odd jobs. They kept to themselves. Then, in early 1798, they suddenly left, traveling north into Kentucky. And the murders began. The first confirmed victim was a peddler named John Langford. His body was found in March 1798 near the Wilderness Road in Knox County, Kentucky. He had been killed with a tomahawk to the back of the head. His goods were scattered, but oddly, the valuable items, silverware, quality cloth, had been left behind. Only the least valuable items, food, and basic supplies were missing. This puzzled investigators at the time. If this were a robbery, why leave the valuable goods? More bodies appeared over the following months. A farmer named Stigall, a young boy named Coffee, 2 Virginia men traveling to Nashville, a Methodist preacher, a slave who had been traveling with his owner. By the end of 1798, at least a dozen people had been killed along the roads of Kentucky and Tennessee, all in roughly the same manner, all with valuable possessions left on or near the bodies. Locals began to panic. Stories spread of 2 wild men, outlaws, who were killing indiscriminately. Posses formed. Men traveled in groups for safety. Women and children stayed home. In August 1799, a man named Moses Stegall returned home to find his cabin destroyed and his wife and child murdered. The Harpy brothers had been staying with him as guests. They'd killed his family, set fire to the cabin, and fled. This was the final outrage. A massive manhunt was organized. Dozens of men on horseback tracking the Harps through the wilderness. The chase lasted for days. On August 24th, 1799, the posse caught up with Micajah Harp. There was a brief gunfight. Micajah was shot and badly wounded. As he lay dying, he reportedly confessed to the murders, though accounts of exactly what he said vary. One account claims he said, "I killed them because they deserved it. All of them were weak." Another account claims he simply laughed and said, "You'll never understand." Moses Stegall, the man whose family Micajah had killed, asked if he could execute Micajah personally. The posse agreed. Stegall cut off Micajah's head while the man was still alive. The head was placed on a pike at a crossroads as a warning. The location became known as Harp's Head, and it kept that name for decades. Wiley Harp escaped. He fled south into Mississippi Territory. He changed his name to John Seton and joined a gang of river pirates led by a man named Samuel Mason. For 4 years, Wiley lived as an outlaw, robbing boats on the Mississippi River, but he never stopped killing. Fellow members of Mason's gang